I've had my fair share of eerie and unsettling experiences, but one in particular has always stood out. It happened during Thanksgiving weekend in 2018. I decided to spend the holiday at my sister's apartment in Chicago, where we were both attending college. She lived off campus in a small apartment with her roommate, while I stayed in a dorm on campus. Since her roommate had gone to Florida to visit family, I offered to keep her company for the weekend. If you've ever been to Chicago in late November, you know how cold and overcast it can be. My sister's neighborhood was in the midst of change. Older buildings were being torn down to make way for new developments, and trendy shops were replacing long-standing businesses. The area felt oddly deserted, especially at night, and her apartment amplified that feeling. It was a narrow unit with 3 bedrooms, a small kitchen, 1 bathroom, and a cozy living room. Most of the apartment remained dim and chilly throughout the day since little sunlight made it inside. The hallway leading to the kitchen had a strange, twisting layout that only added to the uneasiness. From the moment I arrived, I couldn't shake an uncomfortable feeling about the kitchen window. It overlooked a dark alley and back deck, and at night, the absence of outside lighting made it impossible to see anything beyond your own reflection in the glass. Every time I stepped into the kitchen, I had the overwhelming sense that someone was watching me from the shadows beyond the window. I avoided looking at it, but the uneasy feeling persisted. I spent the night sleeping in the living room, while my sister stayed in her bedroom. Her roommate's small, calm dog kept me company. But during the night, I would often wake up to find him at the foot of the futon, softly growling toward the dark hallway. I'd sit up, straining to see what had him so unsettled, but the hallway always appeared empty. One night, I heard it, the slow, deliberate creak of footsteps in the hallway. My heart raced as I immediately thought someone had broken into the apartment. Grabbing a small lamp for protection, I hesitated, trying to calm my nerves. Eventually, I forced myself to investigate, carefully making my way down the hall. But when I reached the kitchen, there was nothing there, and the apartment was silent once more. Later that night, the dog's growling woke me again. This time, as I listened, I clearly heard the heavy, measured steps echoing down the hallway. Suddenly, an image flashed vividly in my mind, a tall man wearing a long brown coat, baggy jeans, and heavy boots standing at the foot of the futon. His expression was cold and furious, and it felt as if he wanted to harm someone. The vision vanished as quickly as it appeared, but the terror lingered, keeping me awake until morning. The next day, I told my sister about the strange events, but she brushed them off as the result of a bad dream. While she took the dog outside, I stayed back to tidy up. I watched her lock both the back door and the glass door behind it before heading out. Not long after, I heard the unmistakable creak of the back door opening, followed by the glass door. Alarmed, I walked to the kitchen and found both doors wide open. Looking out the window, I saw my sister far down the alley, completely unaware of what had just happened. Shaken, I shut the doors and turned toward the small camera her roommate had mounted on the fridge. Checking the footage later, we saw something chilling. Both doors had opened on their own, with no one nearby to cause it. When my sister returned, I told her what had happened. She then shared a disturbing story her roommate had once told her. Years ago, a man who had been severely injured by the police ran to the apartment in desperation, believing it was still his home. Unaware that it had been years since he'd lived there, he tried to force his way inside but couldn't get the door open. Exhausted and in pain, he collapsed in the doorway and died. Whether the story was true or not, it stuck with me. It felt like it explained the eerie, unshakable feeling that someone, or something, was still lingering in that apartment. During my 3rd year of college, I made the mistake of waiting too long to renew my lease. When I found out I couldn't stay in my current place, I panicked. Almost every rental I found was far out of my price range. Luckily, a few of my coworkers heard about my situation and offered to rent me their upstairs game room for $400 a month, a steal compared to the $900 I had been paying. The room was small, barely large enough for a bed and a desk, but I accepted without hesitation and moved in. My plan was to stay only until January, at which point I'd move downtown with some college friends. The house, located in Montgomery, about 18 minutes from Savannah, was a two-story dark brick structure with a wide front porch and a large yard. Tall oak trees draped in Spanish moss surrounded the property, giving it a peaceful yet eerie vibe, especially at night. My new roommates were older than me but easygoing and fun to be around. One evening, we were sitting in the kitchen playing poker, laughing and joking, when an intense banging shook the front door. The noise was so forceful it made the walls vibrate. Assuming it was our roommate Kyle, who might have forgotten his keys, I got up to let him in. But when I opened the door, no one was there. I stepped outside, scanning the yard, but it was completely empty. Confused, I returned to the kitchen, where my roommates admitted they'd also thought someone was trying to get in. Shaken but trying to shrug it off, we resumed our game. A couple of weeks later, after a brunch shift, my roommate Sean bought a bottle of Jameson. We decided to have a few drinks at the kitchen table, swapping funny work stories and cracking jokes. Out of nowhere, all three of us turned to look at the kitchen counter. I'm not sure why, but something drew our attention to it. Then, to our disbelief, a bowl began sliding slowly across the counter, as if being pushed by an unseen hand. It moved without reason, there was no breeze, no trick, no logical explanation. While we laughed nervously and brushed it off at the time, the experience left a lingering unease. In October, my parents came to visit from North Georgia, bringing along our blue heeler, Duke. We spent the day exploring River Street, enjoying the shops, having dinner, and picking up sweets from the candy kitchen. That evening, my parents told me their hotel didn't allow dogs and asked if I could keep Duke overnight. I was happy to oblige. Back at the house, Duke played with my roommates for a while before we headed up to the game room for the night. My bed was tucked into a corner of the room, facing two large windows on the opposite wall. At some point, I drifted off to sleep with Duke curled up at my feet. I'm usually a deep sleeper, but I woke up suddenly to a low, menacing growl. In the moonlight streaming through the windows, I could see Duke standing stiffly at the foot of the bed, his fur bristling as he stared at something above me. His growl was unlike anything I'd ever heard from him. I froze, unable to see what had him so alarmed, but I could feel a heavy, oppressive presence hovering just over the bed. Instinctively, I reached out, grabbed Duke, and pulled him close. The moment I did, his growling stopped, and the air seemed to clear. Though I eventually fell back asleep, I couldn't shake the unease. When November rolled around, I left the house for a few days to spend Thanksgiving with my family at their small cattle farm in North Georgia. The crisp autumn air and beautiful scenery offered a much-needed break. One afternoon, feeling tired, I went to my room to nap. When I woke up, I couldn't move. My body felt paralyzed, and sweat dripped from my forehead. Out of the corner of my eye, I could see my dresser mirror. Reflected in it was the image of an old woman. Her pale, ghostly skin, wet dark hair, and lifeless expression made my blood run cold. She loomed over me, radiating anger and fear, the air around her suffocatingly heavy. After what felt like an eternity, I finally broke free from the paralysis, leaping out of bed. When I turned around, the woman was gone. By December, my final month at the house, I was ready to leave. One evening, my roommates and I were playing chess at the kitchen table. Out of nowhere, Billy asked Sean about the woman who had lived in the house before us. Sean, who was usually very direct and factual, hesitated before sharing what he'd heard. According to a neighbor, an elderly couple had lived in the house years ago. The husband suffered from severe dementia, and his wife cared for him. One day, the husband was found wandering the neighborhood. When the neighbor brought him home, they noticed a terrible smell inside. After searching the house, they found the wife's lifeless body in the bedroom. She had passed away days earlier. I moved out at the end of the month and never looked back. The house has since been sold. While it's possible that everything I experienced was just random coincidences or tricks of the mind, I can't help but feel that something unexplainable lingered in that house, haunting its kitchen, hallways, and rooms. I've only shared this story with a handful of friends. Some laughed it off, saying it couldn't be true, while others felt just as unsettled as I did that night. It happened on Thanksgiving when I was about 10 years old. My cousin Chris, my brother ARF, and an old friend, David, decided to play a game of hide-and-seek in the neighborhood. What started out as innocent fun quickly turned into something I've never been able to forget. We were all around the same age and loved playing outside, especially to escape the adults and their conversations. There was a thrill to sneaking around the neighborhood in the dark, even if it felt a little eerie. We had a rule not to hide inside the house, but that rule always ended up being broken. That night, ARF and David were the ones hiding, while Chris and I were the seekers. After counting to 100, we went off to find them. 15 minutes passed, then 30, and still, there was no sign of them. By the 45-minute mark, Chris and I started to get concerned. We called out, saying the game was over and asking them to come out, but there was no response. Feeling uneasy, we went inside to check every room, but the only people we found were the adults, laughing and enjoying Thanksgiving dinner. The longer we searched, the more unsettled we became. Eventually, we decided we needed help but didn't want to alarm everyone at the party. Quietly, we approached David's dad and asked if he could come outside to help us look. He agreed and joined us on the driveway, scanning the area to see if he could spot anything we'd missed. As we stood there, David's dad suddenly pointed down the sidewalk, shouting, "That might be your brother." Chris and I turned and saw someone who looked just like my brother, ARF, running away from us. Without thinking, we took off after him, shouting that the game was over and he didn't need to hide anymore. No matter how fast we ran, we couldn't catch up. We stayed about 10 feet behind, watching as he darted toward a pair of palm trees near the corner of a house further down the block. Certain we had him cornered, Chris and I split up, he went to the right side of the trees, and I took the left. But when we checked behind them, there was no one there. We froze, confused. The only way he could have escaped was by passing directly through us or somehow jumping over a 6-foot fence on a hill nearby, both of which were impossible. After a moment of stunned silence, we hurried back to the driveway, where David's dad was waiting. He looked at us seriously and asked, "You guys saw that, right?" Out of breath, we nodded and said, "Of course. We were chasing him." He looked uneasy and replied, "Because ARF and David are inside the house." Chris and I were speechless. We followed him back inside, where we found ARF and David sitting casually, claiming they'd been indoors the whole time, spying on us. When we explained what had happened, no one in the house believed us, even though David's dad backed us up, saying he'd seen the figure too. Everyone brushed it off as a misunderstanding or a trick of the night. To this day, my brother insists it wasn't him, and David swears they never left the house. But something about that night still chills me. When I think back, I remember feeling like I wasn't running as fast as I should have been, as if my legs were moving through water. It's a sensation I can't shake, and I often wonder what would have happened if I'd actually caught up to whoever, or whatever, that was. Whenever Chris and I talk about that night, we refer to the figure as the Red Man, because he wore a red shirt identical to the one my brother was wearing that evening. The memory still haunts me, and I can't help but believe it might have been something beyond explanation.